Let's just start with some basics about Gaza. So I say what was Gaza because I'm talking prior to October 7th, 2023. The Gaza Strip is this part that's in orange. And in 2023, the population was 2.2 million. It's a very concentrated population. It's 1.2 times the population density of New York City, to give you an idea. And to give you an idea of relative to the region, there are, at that time, 9 million roughly Israeli citizens, 700,000 of them in the West Bank, in the rest in this Israel. So you can see that roughly 4 times this population in all this area. So you can see how concentrated this is. In the Gaza Strip, 47% of the population is under 18. And 3/4 of the population are refugees whose families became refugees mostly in 1948, what's called the Nakba or the War of Independence, depending on your perspective. So that's sort of the background on some basics about Gaza. So what happened on October 7th? Hamas launched a barrage of rockets. Those are estimates. An hour later, fighters crossed into Israel by land, air, and sea. Here's a picture of the bulldozer that went through the fence. And motorbikes, paragliders, and pickups. And the last most specific number I saw were that 1163 were killed. Of those 767 civilians, 376 soldiers, and 20 who were taken captive. At least 5,600 were injured, and roughly 240 soldiers and civilians taken captive. I think it's important, and this is not often discussed, but I think it's important to understand the strategies that were incorporated on that day, on October 7th. So Hamas had a goal of taking captives. And I'm careful in my language because we mostly see in our press the word hostages. And since we know that 376 were actually soldiers, probably the more appropriate term for them is prisoners of war, since Gaza is under occupation and has been since 1967. So I'm just calling them captives. In 2006, an Israeli soldier was taken captive by the people in Gaza. I forget if it was Hamas or another group, and ultimately was exchanged in 2011 for 1,027 Palestinian prisoners. So Hamas clearly doesn't have weapons relative to Israel. Israel is, I've heard, the fifth strongest military in the world. It doesn't have fighter jets. It doesn't have tanks. So here you see pictures of some of the hostages that were taken, what looks like something like a golf cart, motorcycles, things of that nature, and machine guns. So these were the major tools that were used, if you want to call them that, weapons in this action on October 7th. And again, so they're not going to win a military war as such. And I'm not justifying anything. I'm just trying to understand the mentality and the approach. Again, I'm a big fan of international law. Taking prisoners of war is legal, but taking civilians is not. Okay, just to be very, very clear. But again, just to understand the logic, this is how Hamas operates. Israel knows this. They know that the only leverage that Hamas will have is really people it takes into custody. And so it has adopted what it calls the Hannibal Directive. And the Hannibal Directive is we're better off killing our own people than letting them be taken hostage. Because we may lose one or two people, so to speak, but we won't have to give up 1,000 prisoners for each person, for example. And so what you see on the bottom is a picture of completely blown out houses that were done with tank shells and so on. And many of the people supposedly, part of the problem with war is truth is the first casualty in war. But supposedly there were helicopter gunships that killed a number of people at the concert, for example. And so, again, I'm not rationalizing anything, but I just want to make sure that we understand sort of how the two parties look at the situation and approach their situation.
Alex, if I may,
Yes.
on the previous slide, you distinguished between the slide before that. You distinguished between taken prisoner, 240, and then there were 20 captives. What's a captive versus a prisoner?
The captives are dead. Those are part of the killed group.
Okay. And then the helicopter was manned by
It's Israeli.
Israeli killed people in the concert.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. So what happened October 8th? And again, that was part of this Hannibal directive. We don't want them taking all these hostages. We're going to kill the terrorists. They didn't kill them just because they were people at the concert. They were killing them because they were trying to get the terrorists as well. And the terrorists who were taking people with them as they saw it. And so better not to give them that opportunity. So what happened October 8th and shortly thereafter? I assume most of us have seen the statement by Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, where he immediately says, I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals and we act accordingly. And so that was in effect. Now, in reality, this was during the Biden administration. Slight amounts of food were allowed in. This is purely conjecture on my part. I suspect it's because of the Biden administration telling them that they can't totally shut down all the food, but that's purely conjecture on my part. So then we started getting a set of directives where Israel moved into the territory and started issuing directives for folks to move. As of today, I think the number is over 2 million out of 2.2 that have been forced to move. And this was part of a presentation I did in November of 2023. And in 1 week, here I show that it dropped 6,000 bombs. A lot of the bombs that they were using are 2,000-pound bombs that the United States supplies. And just to be clear, these 2,000 bombs are not precision munitions. These take out buildings. They're significant. You lay a lot of things to waste. And that's as many as the US dropped in Afghanistan in a whole year. And meanwhile, Hamas continued to send rockets in the early stages. This was from a November of 2023 presentation. It's important to understand, I shared with you sort of Hamas's mindset of getting captives and Israel's Hannibal directive. That was for October 7th, while the things were in motion there. But Israel has always, or since I think the Lebanon war in the 80s, maybe the one in 2006 when it attacked Lebanon, has followed what's called the Dahiyya doctrine. And Dahiyya is a neighborhood in Beirut where Hezbollah has a large stronghold. And the doctrine that Israel adopts is very mob-like in the sense that if they tap you, beat the hell out of them. So they get the message that it's not worth messing with Israel. And To be clear, that's against international law. International law requires proportionate response. But that's been Israel's policy all along. And clearly we're seeing that to a very large extreme level today. And we know that from just the numbers. If you look at 1,200 killed of Israelis, and the conservative numbers are between, 50, 55,000, over 17,000 children, ballpark, those kinds of numbers. It's clearly disproportionate for. And you get language from a number of legislators. Of course, there's Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who are extremely aggressive. But Netanyahu saying, you must remember what Amalek has done to you. And I assume everybody knows about what that means. And that's basically kill everybody. And Amalek, I think, includes killing the donkeys and so on. So it's basically a scorched earth approach. So just to sort of wrap up the situation in Gaza, this is from Al Jazeera. It's from February, so it's not even very current. But again, you get the idea of not only 60,000 and by the way, the 60,000 originally were numbers of people who came to hospitals that they actually had the names of. There were like 11,000, or here it says 14,000 remain missing or presumed dead. And there are many that are beyond that, people dying from starvation and so on. What's important, I think, also to note in this issue is that the West Bank has had significant deaths as well. And Hamas is not operating in the West Bank. And so the whole framing of the issue of Israel's actions being because of October 7th, you can argue that maybe for what's happening in Gaza, but you can't in the West Bank. And I believe. And so there's a real issue there. And in fact, before October 7th, there were already 350 Palestinians dead in 2023. So a quarter of what was lost by Israel had already been lost by Palestinians of that year. And of course, the United States media doesn't cover that and so on. But here are some rough numbers. What's interesting is, I mentioned to you that before October 7th, Gaza was one of the most densely populated places, 1.2 times the density of New York. Today, only 18% of Gaza remains outside Israel declared military zones or displacement orders. So that's basically multiplying it by 5. So now the population density is 6 times that of New York City, because they're all being stuffed. And you don't have apartment buildings and so on. There are a lot of tents and so on. So it's extremely densely packed with very little infrastructure, no sewage, running water, etc. Since March 2nd of this year, a complete blockade went on for humanitarian aid for 78 days. Since then, only a minimal amount is allowed, but no food, no water, no fuel, no medical supplies. And I'm sure you all have seen the pictures of children starving and malnourished. It's important the United States doesn't cover this, but there are over 9,000, I've seen numbers as over 10,000 Palestinians held in prisons in Israel. And these are since October 7th. And this includes over 300 medical workers, which is against international law, 400 children. And there are a couple doctors who have died under torture in Israeli prisons. And so the conditions are horrific. The Freedom Flotilla, as you all, I'm sure know, there were a number of people, it was intercepted in international waters. And one of the people who got out had caught scabies in prison, in Israeli prison. And that was just for being there a few days. So you can imagine what it's like for Palestinians. I've seen pictures of Palestinians coming out of Israeli prison where they're literally unrecognizable after being in there 6 months. The one thing that's unique about this war is that journalists from outside have not been allowed to enter. And there are more than 200 Palestinian journalists in Gaza who have been killed. Again, that's against international law. The damage is absolutely extensive. If anybody has not seen pictures, let me know. I'll show some I'm almost done here with this presentation, but I'm happy to show you pictures. And I think it's worth looking at them because it's when you see the devastation, let me see if I can find it right. When you see the devastation, it's clear that they're bombing complete neighborhoods and actually leveling and bulldozing them. That's not going after Hamas. That is making Gaza unlivable. And when you've bombed every single university, when most of the hospitals have been destroyed or bombed and damaged, 88% of school buildings destroyed or damaged, 92% of the housing units, units, not united, and 80% of commercial properties destroyed. And same with agricultural land. So Gaza used to get 500 trucks a day before October 7th of food and such, because again, it's so densely populated and there's no freedom of movement or freedom of commerce, import, export. So they are dependent on humanitarian aid. And there are still 53 hostages that remain in Gaza, but all the living ones are now military. So they're all prisoners of war in Gaza. And again, about 9,000 in Israel. Let's talk a little bit about the history. A lot of people I've heard say Hamas started it on October 7th. And I think it's important to look back. This is the last little more than 20 years of people that were killed. The red ones are Palestinians, the blue ones are Israelis. And this is through October 6th. And I don't know if you've also heard people say in the media, October 7th was unprecedented, for example. Yes, it was unprecedented for Israelis, but it was clearly not unprecedented for Palestinians. You can see in 2014, over 2,200 Palestinians were killed. I believe that was Operation Protective Edge. And then in December of 2008 and January of 2009 was Operation Cast Lead, which was almost as many people. And so anyway, there's a long history. And of course, we can go back to the Nakba in 1948 when more than 10,000, I've seen numbers like 15,000 Palestinians were killed, including through today. This is what the numbers look like. So here is the roughly 1,200, 1,160 Israelis who were killed on October 7th. And you can see that since then, very few have been killed. So the bombing, the ones who are killed are primarily soldiers in Gaza that Hamas is fighting on location. But these numbers, again, most of them are women and children, and obviously not all men are militants, but the scale is just astronomical. I want to, since there are many of you who are very well versed on the history, I figured I'd do it from a slightly different angle. And this will get us into the mindset. One of the books I wrote, I don't know if you all know Miko Peled, but his father was an Israeli general in the 1967 war. And as a young man, fought in 1948. And when Miko read my book, he said, "Oh, you're missing Roy Rothberg's eulogy. You need to include that in your book." And I had not heard of it. And he said, "It's the Gettysburg Address for Israelis. And when I read it, it really resonated with me that way because the Gettysburg Address was at a time that was very tumultuous in our country. And it's a speech about the 70 years ago or whatever. It was about the concepts of creating our country and the vision we had for the future. And similarly, the eulogy is the same thing. And I highly encourage you all to read it. Let me see if I can share another screen and maybe we'll just read it because I think it's really important to understand this mentality. So this is an article from Times of Israel, and it says, when Moshe Dayan delivered the defining speech of Zionism. And so Roy Rotberg was a settler in a kibbutz right on the edge of Gaza. He was murdered by people from Gaza who ambushed him basically and killed him. And so I'm just going to read the first two paragraphs. Here it is. Yesterday with daybreak, Roy was murdered. The quiet of spring morning blinded him, and he did not see the stalkers of his soul on the furrow. Let us not hurl blame at the murderers. Why should we complain of their hatred for us? 8 years have they sat in the refugee camps of Gaza and seen with their own eyes how we have made a homeland of the soil and the villages where they and their forebears once dwelt. Not from the Arabs of Gaza must we demand the blood of Roy, but from ourselves, how our eyes are closed to the reality of our fate, unwilling to see the destiny of our generation in its full cruelty. Have we forgotten that this small band of youths settled in Nahal Oz carries on its shoulders the heavy gates of Gaza, beyond which hundreds of thousands of eyes and arms huddle together and pray for the onset of our weakness so that they may tear us to pieces? Has this been forgotten? For we know that if the hope of our destruction is to perish, we must be morning and evening, armed and ready. I'll read one more paragraph. A generation of settlement are we, and without the steel helmet and the maw of the cannon, we shall not plant a tree nor build a house. Our children shall not have lives to live if we do not dig shelters, and without the barbed wire fence and the machine gun, we shall not pave a path nor drill for water. The millions of Jews annihilated without a land peer out at us from the ashes of Israeli history and command us to settle and rebuild a land for our people. But beyond the furrow that marks the border lies a surging sea of hatred and vengeance, yearning for the day that the tranquility blunts our alertness, for the day that we heed the ambassadors of conspiring hypocrisy who call for us to lay down our arms. And so I think this is really telling of the psyche, of the situation, it's what the Zionism project. Here is Moshe Dayan. At that time, he was defense minister, was saying that 8 years prior, they had expelled these people and taken their land, and that the people in Gaza wanted vengeance, and that the only way that Israel could develop as its Jewish state was to remain militarily strong to prevent it from the vengeance from happening, from people wanting to come back to their land. And I think that's really important to have that as an understanding that this is all part of a long pattern And then since then, that was 1956, we had the Six-Day War when Israel took control of Gaza. Then we had the first Intifada, which started in Gaza, and that's when Hamas was formed from that issue. In 2006, Hamas was elected for a majority position in the Palestinian Authority legislature. And immediately, Israel imprisoned a number of the elected officials, and Hamas took control of Gaza by force because Israel intervened. And then Israel put on the blockade in 2007. Then I shared with you the bars of Operation Cast Lead. Then we have Operation Protective Edge, and then there's the March of Return in 2018. So there's a long history of that. And you've seen pictures like this. This is white phosphorus, which is considered a chemical weapon, not to be used in civilian areas. And so what I share with people is this is from a presentation I made in 2018. This is not 2023. And I go through that again. Let me see here. So this is blockade issues. And 97% of the Gaza water was unfit for human consumption. And that's partly because Israel has what they called mow the lawn, which was periodically go and bomb infrastructure and folks. And they bomb power plants and sewage systems. This is 45% of medicines were absent in warehouses. 50% of Palestinian children needed psychological counseling because of every couple of years being bombed. Because just so everybody knows, some people say that Gaza was not occupied when Hamas took over. The international courts have actually ruled on that it's been occupied since 1967. And the rationale that the international courts use are that Israel has, I forget the exact term, but basically control. They control the borders. They are in the airspace 24/7 with their drones. They are in Gaza waters with their ships. They control, if you look at the map, you remember how in the Berlin Wall, there was this no-go zone in East Berlin that if anybody got into it, you got shot. The no-go zone in Gaza is on the Gaza side, and Israel enforces on the Gaza side and shoots people. And that's what happened in the 2018 March of Return, for example. So furthermore, everybody in Gaza is on the Israeli population registry. If they want to go anywhere, they have to get permission. And so this bullet right here, it relates to medical transfers, getting permission. If you get a number of stories of people who've gotten accepted into universities, for example, in the United States or the UK, and were not allowed to go by Israel. They couldn't get their permits to leave. And again, because the economy, one of the things that the blockade imposed was also exports. So you think when something is not security based, when it's limiting exports, because you might say that imports, they're worried about bringing in weapons or bringing in other things. But when you're selling things abroad, you can't say that's for security reasons. That's to crush the economy. And therefore, you have these numbers like 44% of adults are unemployed and 65% of families live in poverty. And because they have limited building supplies, when they bomb, you can't rebuild very easily, and it takes a very long time because so many of the supplies are limited. Part of the language issue that I think is really important is that you're conscious of the words. That's why I call my books Learning to Speak Israel. It's because words in English have a different meaning when you're talking about Israel. So the term defensive, for example, Israel calls taking land by force and oppressing people and violating the human rights as defensive. So they took part of Lebanon recently, defensive. They took part of the Golan Heights in 1967. They say it's defensive. The moving out of people out of Gaza, it's defensive, right? Another word, again, is democracy. Usually we associate that in English as self-determination of all people. But in the case of Israel, no, it requires occupation. Because if you gave the rights to the equality, it wouldn't be a Jewish majority state, and so on.